Today's episode of the Energy Question podcast is brought to you by Enverus. The energy industry faces challenges every day, and the events of the last 2 years have caused massive disruptions like never before. Companies in the energy industry need actionable intelligence and a single source of truth that brings all the data together. Enverus is the energy specialized technology partner that provides intelligent connections for a global energy ecosystem. Only Enverus has the analytics, people, experience, and industry scope to connect the right data and information in the right way to discover missed opportunities and deliver fast outcomes. Find out more at Enverus.com. That's ENVERUS.com.
Well, hello again. I'm David Blackmon. This is the Energy Question with David Blackmon. My very special guest today is Dan Yergin, who is the Vice Chairman of S&P Global, and also best-selling author of a series of books about the energy business, The Prize, The New Map, and The Quest was the second book. The New Map is the most current book, and we're going to talk a bit about that today. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, David, it's nice to be back talking with you again. Thank you for the invitation.
That's always a pleasure. I want to start by talking about the new map. And when we talked in July, it had become so evident, 4 months, I guess, then into this war between Russia and Ukraine, that world events were progressing in a way that is eerily similar to the predictions that you had made in the new map. And it's really pretty extraordinary. And I wanted to just start by talking about, what you're seeing now. Is it still, do you wake up and look at the news and say, man, that was on page 127 each day, right? Is that how your day usually goes?
Or page 78, as the case may be. It was what, I think I think the new map did say that Ukraine was the issue that was going to blow up, and it was going to be very tied into energy in Europe and so forth. And I think what the book does is, provide the context for how we got to February 24th and how we got to where we are today by, Putin's views on Ukraine, the use of energy, the battles over natural gas, because that's the context to explain where this all came from, and the basic fact that Vladimir Putin refused to accept the reality that Ukraine was a separate country. Yeah. He had a Imperial Vision, and that's what's now playing out in the battlefield and is disrupting global energy markets.
And it is an Imperial Vision. Do you think, and I know there's a debate about this, do you think Putin's Imperial Vision is limited to these territories in Ukraine or all of Ukraine, or is it more grand than that?
Well, I think it started off being all of Ukraine. He wanted to take Kiev, and he thought he'd take it in a couple of days. His soldiers heading towards Kiev carried ceremonial uniforms for the victory parade in Kiev that never happened. I think the view was that, if he were to succeed in this, then he was interested. He had said, and I quote him in the book, saying that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Right. And he wanted to reverse that. And it was not just a Soviet view, but it was a view of a Russian empire. So I think Kazakhstan, for instance, saw that there would be pressure on it. And countries like Poland, that had been part of this kind of Soviet empire, thought they were next, or the Baltic countries were next. But the things have not gone the way that Putin thought they would go.
Right. Yeah, and there's a lot of talk about, because oil prices have gone up so much, and natural gas too this year, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that Russia's energy revenues have actually been much higher than anyone had anticipated. I think back in February they might be. And but he's really not doing well financially. The country, Russia as a country, is really not prospering in any way from this war, correct?
That's right. I mean, certainly his oil revenues are higher this year than they were last year because the oil price is up. Uh, his gas revenues have gone down dramatically because he's not sending natural gas to Europe. But overall, I think what he's done is he's destroyed 22 years of economic integration with the world, particularly with Europe, with the United States. That's now over. That door's been slammed shut, and the sanctions will have increasing impact on Russia, and it will be a weaker economy. And also, by the way, David, I'm very struck that just the last couple of weeks since the number of young men who have left Russia, some estimate 700,000, some estimate 1 million. That's incredible in 2 or 3 weeks. And these are the most vital, energetic. They're computer engineers, they're technologists, they're people in business. They've all left the country. So that's another way that his economy has been damaged by this. So I think he ends up, and I spent a lot of time writing about the basis of the relationship between President Xi of China and Putin, and between Russia and China. And I think Russia ends up increasingly an economic dependency of China when this comes to an end. It's already happening.
Yeah, it already is. And I also wonder about your views on our relationship with Saudi Arabia right now, because it's all kind of interrelated, right? We had the cut from OPEC Plus recently, 2 million barrels a day, even though the Biden administration had warned the Saudis and other members of OPEC Plus that the U.S. would consider that to be a hostile act, and they went ahead with it anyway. And we now see this big fracture of the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia happening. And I wonder, isn't that really just kind of even more than already was happening, pushing Saudi Arabia into that Russia and China kind of geopolitical orbit? Well,
certainly, if you look at it, Saudi Arabia's main markets for oil are not, the United States. It used to be, but it's China, it's Asia. I think that decision, of course, is the top number is 2 million. It's really 1 million barrels a day.
Right.
And it occurred at a time, the Biden administration was certainly pushing against that, concerned about inflation, concerned about oil prices. I think it's now kind of escalated in an unfortunate way. I mean, the whole way it's unfolding is not constructive because, it adds to the difficulties. There are 3 major oil producers in the world today: Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. And it's important that the United States have a dialogue and a relationship with Saudi Arabia. It's a two-way street for sure.
Yeah.
And there are other issues there like Iran and so forth, regional stability. So my own hope is that this kind of rhetoric will come down, and people will look practically, what are their interests, what's important. And at a time when you have this tension, well, not a tension, worse tension with Russia, and the rising tension with China, which is reflected in the new national security document from the Biden administration, it's better to try and stabilize relationships with other countries. And Saudi Arabia is an important country.
Yeah.
But it is, this came on the a month before the midterm elections. It came when central banks are raising interest rates. And of course, the Saudis, for their part, and OPEC Plus said this was in response to what is widely seen now to be becoming a recession. But of course, that's not the way it's been seen in Washington.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned, of course, that the top line was 2 million, but the bottom line, really, the actual impact is 1 million because of OPEC Plus's undershooting of its targets over the past year. And it wasn't enough, right? I mean, we had an initial, for a couple of trading days, jump up in the price of crude, but then it's sort of just kind of fallen back down. And
yeah, it really is. It's really back to where it was, or even, obviously from day to day it will change and events will change it, but it's kind of back to where we were before the war began. And I think there's another factor at work, which is not only, of course, this pretty gloomy view about the world economy that is developed in response to the fight against inflation. But the other factor, that this kind of is a lead into December 5th, and December 5th is a very important date because that's when the European ban on the import of seaborne Russian crude oil goes into effect. But it also has something else there too, which is it bans insurance and shipping services. And so in response to that, I think Washington woke up and said, well, whoa, if that goes into effect, you could have a 7 million barrel a day hole in the world oil market. And then subsequently, because a few months later, there's going to be a ban on products. And it's sort of come up with this notion of a price cap to try and reduce those revenues that you were talking about, David, on one side, but keep the oil flowing on the other side. And this kind of price cap, just on Russian oil has never been imposed before. And I think that was something else that the OPEC plus countries were worried about. And of course, one of the OPEC plus countries happens to be Russia.
Right. And the price cap, when they first started talking about that, I have to say, I just laughed. I don't understand how that is an enforceable mechanism. Do you think? I mean, it's the EU and the United States essentially trying to put that in place. Is that really in any way doable in a real sense?
I think just today I was listening to one of the people from the administration. I was at a meeting with them talking about it. And they point out it's not, India doesn't impose it, China doesn't. It's up to the shippers and the insurance companies to attest that they have sought to buy Russian oil at some discount to whatever the Brent price is. Now, David, your point to one of the key things is, well, what's the price going to be set at? Is it going to be something? I think their notion, the notion here in the administration, and now the Europeans, is that it will be set high enough that the Russians will say, hey, it doesn't really matter, we're still getting our revenues. But the Russians have been vitriolic in denouncing it.
Sure.
I see several Russian spokespeople calling it, that you all use the word absurd. And there's a risk that, Russia could seize upon it and reduce supplies, either directly or indirectly, creating a tight market in which it wouldn't work. So this is it has, great ambitions, which is to reduce Russian revenues, but keep the oil flowing. But something like this has not been done before. So I think we're now in October, and looking between now and December, we'll start to see, can it really work? It will be tested. Really, it will be tested by the marketplace.
So I want to talk about the energy crisis in Europe as well. They're in a terrible crisis. This winter is looking pretty bleak in Europe, and I wonder if I would like to have your view as to whether Europe has been able to do enough to secure enough supply to keep homes heated and the lights on this winter. Enverus, which is our show sponsor, had a report a couple of weeks ago in which they projected that it's possible, not likely, but possible, that parts of Europe could actually run out of natural gas along around March or April of next year if these measures to really dramatically reduce consumption are not successful. Do you have a view on that?
Well, I think it's it's very contingent. A lot depends upon the weather. If it's a warm winter, they'll manage. If it's a cold winter, it's going to be, in the way you said, quite challenging. They did one thing. They got storage filled.
Right.
And during the winter, storage provides normally about 25% of supplies. Demand is down somewhat at great pain because, some of the gas going into Europe now is at 10 times the normal price. And so it's a huge impact. And whether they have shortages or not, this is having a terrible impact on the European economy. And it's deliberate, by the way. I mean, Putin in St. Petersburg conference in June laid out the strategy to do this. It's really It's a second front in the Ukraine war, which is an energy war in Europe, where his aim is to impose so much pain that the coalition breaks and new governments come to power.
Right.
But I think Europe, it's interesting to see, that suddenly something that was just off the agenda and forgotten about, energy security, is back on the agenda.
Right.
I think it was last year that France refused to accept a cargo of U.S. LNG because it was produced with shale gas.
Right.
Now the French are thrilled. They're here, like the other Europeans, seeing how much gas can they get from U.S. LNG exporters. And last year, maybe 30% of U.S. LNG went to Europe. Now it's close to 70%. Now U.S. LNG has become kind of part of this security foundation, energy security foundation for Europe. But I think, if it's a cold winter, we'll see rationing. A lot of concern in Germany, whether does this lead to deindustrialization, because you're going to take care of homeowners first.
Right.
We've seen the French government say that, government institutions should be at 66 degrees. And if I did the conversion from centigrade, right, they're saying that, French people in your house and in your bedroom, you've got to be down at 63 degrees or 62 degrees. Ooh. So that's a lot of sweaters.
It's kind of chilly, particularly from a guy like me from Texas. That's almost freezing in Texas.
Well, it is. I mean,
on natural gas, we mentioned price caps on oil. Of course, Europe is now, some in Europe, I shouldn't say Europe, but some in Europe are complaining about the prices they're having to pay for the U.S. LNG, right? Which is essentially...
And LNG from other sources, too.
And from other sources. I mean, and it's, of course, what the market demands or what the market will bear. But, they're talking about trying some way to cap the price of those LNG imports. And I just wonder what your view on that is and whether that can actually happen.
Yeah, I think it's not a good idea because, price is a magnet. And if that magnet loses its power, then those supplies will go to Asia or Southeast Asian countries, which we don't hear much about, but they're the ones who can't afford LNG anymore. They're either burning coal or they're just going to have blackouts. And, they're really being hit very hard. They don't have the economic resources that Europe has. So there are a couple of different things, that different directions. One is that discussion about a price cap. The second is putting a windfall tax on non-LNG electricity generators, like people who are generating electricity with wind, for instance, or solar or so forth. And the third thing is just subsidizing consumers, protecting the consumers with, which costs a lot of money, at the same time urging them to use less. But so I think it is it's terribly painful. We don't really experience it or feel it in the United States, what it's like, but suddenly people are looking at energy bills far beyond anything that they'd ever budgeted before. So I think one of the big reactions, and we've seen it in Germany and other countries and Britain, is to get money to the consumers to protect them against this. And that seems, more like that's kind of the path, rather than, a price cap on LNG imports would, reduce the supply of LNG to Europe.
Yeah. And of course, there's already a limit to how much the United States can export to Europe. And limiting that further would not be a great idea.
I mean, there isn't much more. I mean, right now, the U.S. is tied with Australia more or less as the world's largest exporter of LNG.
Yeah.
But between now and 2026, there isn't a lot of new supply coming on. Obviously, people are seeking to accelerate projects in the United States, and the U.S. will be a source of marginal new supply.
So back to the OPEC U.S. relationship, and the Biden administration is now talking about taking measures, and they haven't been specific yet, but we're starting to hear rumors of, one I read about today is a limitation on U.S. exports now of refined products.
Yeah. So let me say, in 2 words, terrible idea.
I totally agree. Yeah.
It would be, first, it's not clear that it would work at all, because of the mismatch of product and refining and moving it around.
Right.
Secondly, it would be a distortion in the market. It would reduce the efficiency of U.S. refineries. And thirdly, David, it would be a terrible message to the world. It would announce that the U.S. is not a reliable supplier.
Right.
Sorry, Europe, you can't count on the United States. Sorry, Latin America, you can't count on the United States. And that would be, it would be completely counter to the whole notion of being a reliable supplier. And it would suddenly mean that, U.S. people would worry about U.S. LNG exports. So, it would be a decision. They're obviously incredibly sensitive to gasoline prices, but it might sound popular politically, but it wouldn't work, and it would really be a serious undercutting of U.S. unity with Europe right now.
Yeah.
Imagine the impact on Europe if you saw this. The United States, which goes against saying people should be reliable suppliers and don't cut off supplies, suddenly cuts off supply.
Well, you're so much closer to it than I am. You're in Washington, in meetings, as you mentioned earlier. And I wonder what else you're hearing in terms of, what could the United States do? Just in terms of, I almost want to say sanctions on OPEC countries for a supply cut.
I think it would be really, right now, what would you accomplish by sanctions? All you would do is introduce further tension and disruption and dislocation in the global markets. I think the most important thing is to do everything that's possible to keep the markets flowing, rather than seeking to punish other countries that are major sources of oil that, by the way, you're counting on in a crisis to be able to put more oil into the market. So it would just be ill-timed. Obviously it's such a politically charged atmosphere in the United States right now in the month before the midterms.
Right.
But I think one has to kind of think, not even long-term, just midterm, and say, what are your main objectives? Your main objectives is to have the world energy markets function as well as they can. And going to battle, it's one thing, rhetorically is one thing, but to do it in terms of policy would just be, I think, a setback from overall objectives.
Back to natural gas, one of the major events that happened recently that's kind of fallen out of the news, because no one has taken credit for it, is the destruction, the sabotage of Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipeline systems from Russia, 2 major natural gas pipelines. What are the implications of that act, whoever did it, regardless of who did it, to Europe's energy security going forward? Russia said the other day it would take a year.
It is this big question of, who did it and why.
Right.
I would say, and there's no, there are no fingerprints right now that at least we generally know about. A lot of people think it was the Russians to sort of show the vulnerability of infrastructure. And they point out that it occurred the same day that, virtually the same day as the new natural gas pipeline from Norway to Poland went into effect.
Yeah.
Others say, why would the Russians do it? Because someday they would like to, when this is all over, would like to be able to ship gas again to Europe. But it was quite traumatic when you think about the long battle over, as I write about in the new map, over Nord Stream and then Nord Stream 2. And, I think what it does symbolize is that Europe basically just wants to reduce over time its dependence on energy from Russia. I mean, it's a very bumpy road to do that. But Russia has basically for decades and decades, Russia and before that the Soviet Union said, we are a reliable supplier. Whatever happens politically, we'll keep supplying you.
Right.
Well, that's not what's happening right now.
Yeah.
And I think Europe is saying we just don't want to depend upon Russian energy in the future. And it looks now that they're going to cut back on some of the other imports from Russia too, like aluminum and titanium. So, I mean, Russia, from an economic point of view, has basically destroyed its biggest and most important market, which was Europe.
So one of the implications of doing that, and of course I understand the motivations behind the sanctions, the war is an atrocity, and everyone I think agrees on that. But one of the implications of these sanctions, as you mentioned earlier, is pushing Russia almost inexorably to become a client, essentially, of China. Because that's, and India to a lesser extent, but I mean, they have to have trade relationships somewhere. So what are the implications?
I think the Indian relationship is quite different. India is sort of one of those countries, it's importing more Russian oil, but it's in the middle. Because remember, India is also aligned with the United States, Japan, and Australia in what's called the Quad, which is trying to, manage China's expansionism, I guess we could say, or what. I think, I always think of that scene that I described in the new map in 2019 when I was in St. Petersburg, and Putin and Xi were on the podium together, and just how closely aligned they are. They describe each other, I don't know if it's really true, as each other's best friends. And I have another scene in the book where Putin brought Xi's favorite Russian ice cream to him for his birthday. I mean, it's like, really? I mean, it's kind of just in this box. What I don't know is what flavor it was. I wasn't able to find that out. But I think that, so I think this was the direction Putin had been saying for years, that Russia was going to go pivot to the east, but it really wasn't happening. But now I think it happens, and I think it's just because they're aligned politically, geopolitically as well. They're aligned in their opposition to an international order that they see dominated by the United States and to a lesser degree Western Europe, and they want to create a different international order. And I was on a call earlier this week with a prominent Russian sort of geopolitical, I guess, strategist in Moscow, who's in Moscow, and he was saying that Russia now is it's going to look to what are called the BRICS, the developing world, obviously China and India, as kind of its future, and not with the Western nations. I think it's going to hurt its economy. It's going to hold it back. But that's that was happening before the war, and now, of course, it's been accelerated. And then if Russia does use tactical nuclear weapons, we're in a further new period.
Are we already in World War III? The early stages of a world war?
I hope not. I think Putin has threatened nuclear war. Some of us can remember when we were in elementary school, and the teacher would say flash and simulating a nuclear attack, and you were supposed to get under your desk. And I'd sort of forgotten that until Putin started threatening again. In the paperback, I have a section I've added called "The Four Ghosts Who Haunt the South China Sea." And the reason I wrote that is because in addition to Taiwan, the other area of kind of direct confrontation is the South China Sea, because China claims it. People don't focus on it now, focused on Ukraine. But I say to our listeners and viewers and readers, pay attention to the issues between the United States and China. And I wrote that as a warning that you could look at this, and I don't want to be melodramatic or overstated, but you kind of see reminded of the British-German rivalry before the First World War. I mean, everything is different, but it is a sense of going in that direction. And the new national security document from the Biden administration talks about China, as the great rival. I mean, you could look at this new Inflation Reduction Act. It's also, as the CHIPS Act on semiconductors,
right,
is a China Competition Act too.
Yeah.
And the Chinese are in the same direction. And, we're seeing this effort to kind of break the supply chains and links coming from both sides that are so enormous. The $600 billion trade relationship between China and the United States, the investment that Western, U.S. companies have made. So I think, as terrible as this war is, the main geopolitical question for the next few decades is, how does the relationship between the United States and China develop? That will affect energy markets, and it will affect everything else.
Yeah. Well, last question. We're running out of time, unfortunately. What's next for you? I know you have a very busy life already. Any big projects in the works?
Well, it's funny. People ask me, what's the next book? I think that I'm living, and I think we're all living the new map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. It's what's happening. So I'm very engaged. I think, as you know, when we talked in July, I think we were just finishing our big project on copper.
Yes.
Because I was very interested.
I wrote about that in Forbes.
Yes, that's right. And so just continuing to be engaged with that. And the other thing is kind of saying, looking at, now that energy security is back, and makes you look, much discussion about the energy transition, but kind of looking at what are the really major questions that need to be thought through about an energy transition.
Yeah.
And the difference between PowerPoint and the real world is the way I would put it. So that's very much on my agenda. And then, of course, we have our big CERAWeek conference coming up next March, and that's not so far away.
Yeah, that's a year-round project, just getting that organized, isn't it? Well,
yeah, exactly.
I would love to have you back to talk about the energy transition. I'm sorry we didn't get to any of that today, but I hope we can talk again in the near future about that.
Yeah, David, we'll definitely continue. I really value the conversations with you and the topics that we range over. So we will resume in due course. So, and thank you very much for the opportunity today to get together and talk while we're in the midst of this very turbulent change that's going around all around the energy world and the world in general.
Not the most pleasant discussion, but it is what it is. But thank you so much. And that's all today for the Energy Question. Thanks to Enverus for being our sponsor, and we will see you next time.